And welcome back here to World Talks. I'm Anna Kalczyńska. The Russian army has launched yet another massive combined strike on Kyiv overnight, killing at least 9 people and sparking fires throughout the capital. The road to peace in Ukraine appears therefore more uncertain than ever. A high-level ceasefire meeting in London was, in the meantime, abruptly cancelled following the absence of US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a move that not only disrupted planned discussions but signaled deeper divisions within the transatlantic diplomatic front. At the heart of the disagreement lies a critical issue: Ukraine's firm refusal to negotiate the status of Crimea. While President Donald Trump publicly criticized Volodymyr Zelensky for his stance, Kyiv remains adamant that Crimea, annexed by Russia in 2014, is non-negotiable. To help us unpack these rapidly evolving dynamics, we are joined now by Andreas Umland, analyst at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies and one of the leading voices of the Eastern European geopolitics. Good morning, sir. Thank you for joining.
Good morning. Thanks for having me again.
So let me start by the latest. The Russian army has launched, as we heard, a massive strike on Kyiv overnight, killing at least 9 people and sparking fires. So why is it happening precisely now? What kind of strategy is Russia manifesting?
Well, this is the usual Russian way of negotiating, basically getting a gag contract, an agreement signed under pressure, under duress. And we saw that, for instance, with the Minsk agreements in 2014, 2015, when there was also escalation in the Donbass before these were signed, then under pressure by Ukraine. And now seemingly Russia wants to do something similar. I'm not sure, though, that this will have the same effect as back then with the Minsk agreements, because the people in the West also see these horrible pictures, and that is not exactly something that that makes them more inclined to go for a compromise with Putin, although the US obviously is trying to get concessions out of Ukraine.
Exactly. So let's discuss this plan, this peace plan. Apart from the question of Crimea that I mentioned before, the US also proposed lifting sanctions against Russia. In exchange, Russia would end hostilities in Ukraine, but no security guarantees were mentioned. On the other hand, no demilitarization of Ukraine, as previously demanded by Russia, was mentioned. So how do you view this peace proposal?
It's, I think, really not worth discussing it, because there's not really much that the US is proposing here. It's simply a recognition of the current state of affairs, and then there are some minor territorial exchanges proposed, and then this idea that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant would go under American control and then deliver electricity to both Ukraine and Russia. And so it's the US is not really offering here something for Ukraine. It's basically just saying that Ukraine should give up territories and sovereignty, and that's it. And the main thing here seems to be actually, as you mentioned, the cancelling of the sanctions and the resumption of US-Russian trade, although that trade has not been that large before the war and before the large-scale invasion.
Excuse me, but we apparently have a breaking news right now, and let me quote Andrzej Duda, Polish president, says that Ukraine will have to make some concessions and compromises in the Russia peace talks, in the peace talks with Russia, obviously. So what could that mean, and how do you read this statement? What do you make of it?
Yeah, I'm not so surprised by it. I mean, the proposal that Zelensky made more than a month ago for an immediate ceasefire was, in fact, already a concession, because this means that the current front line would turn into a contact line, and that means that large parts of Ukrainian territory would then be beyond this contact line. So these concessions have been already made. The thing about the NATO membership that is often mentioned is that Ukraine also recognizes now that this is not an immediate aim that Ukraine can achieve, but it will not change its constitution, where NATO membership is fixed. To make such statements is easier than to then explain how this would be actually implemented. Let's say a change of the Ukrainian constitution where the aim of NATO membership would be then deleted, or where perhaps even the Crimea's belonging to Ukraine would be then deleted. So that is not actually politically possible for any politician in Ukraine. The concessions are mainly about the current front line, and they have been basically already been made by Ukraine.
Well, but some say it's the best Ukraine can get right now. And another thing is if Vladimir Putin would agree, actually, for the terms supposedly offered by the Americans. But clearly, through the voices of such as this one by Andrzej Duda, the Americans are putting pressure on Ukraine. So do you think that somehow Ukraine can take this into consideration?
I think there could be then a sort of a fixation, for instance, of the front line as the new contact line accepted by Ukraine if there are serious security guarantees. If, for instance, Trump would say, we will continue supporting Ukraine with deliveries of weaponry and of intelligence information, if we would, the Americans, I mean, provide a sort of support for European boots on the ground in Ukraine, then I think there could be something that the Kyiv leadership could consider. But without these security guarantees, the deal is now proposed by Trump is worse than simply a ceasefire, much worse, I would even argue. And it's also in strange contradiction to American Republican foreign policies. The NATO membership perspective was introduced by George Bush Jr. in 2008, and in 2018, actually the Trump administration, in the form of a statement of the US Secretary of State, recognized Crimea as permanently belonging to Ukraine, and now Trump is reversing his own former policies with his readiness to recognize Crimea as a part of Russia.
We know very well that trying to balance the justice for Ukraine with the geopolitical reality and demands coming from Moscow is a tough game. But why the US seem offended today by the Ukraine unwillingness to accept terms that are simply impossible to accept, as you mentioned, and also walking away from this peace negotiations by the Americans with definitely shrink their leverage on Kyiv and Moscow. So it's not in America's interest, I imagine.
It's very difficult to actually recognize what is in America's interests here, because we have these contradictory policies where a Republican president reverses earlier Republican foreign policy and is also undermining the non-proliferation regime for nuclear weapons, because as we have already discussed many times, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in the early 1990s against so-called security assurances from, among others, the United States. And now suddenly the United States is not any longer ready to accept the territorial integrity, national sovereignty of Ukraine, or is basically making concessions on this. And that was not the deal from the early 1990s. So to me, it all looks that this is all about trade with Russia and some maybe a Trump Tower in Moscow, and some sort of good relationship with Russia, and then perhaps the larger strategic aim behind is some sort of restoration of US-American relations to break up the Russian-Chinese alliance. That may be the larger aim behind all of that. But that is all very ill-informed. It's ill-informed both on East European affairs and on Russian-Chinese relations. None of this will work.
And so what is the role of the European powers, in your view, they are playing right now in the peace process? Are they sidelined or are they very much still influential?
They have been sidelined by the US and Russia, which is a strange reversal from earlier policies of Russia, where Russia was doing exactly the opposite. In 2014, there was first the so-called Geneva format, where the US was involved in the negotiations between the EU, Russia, and Ukraine. And then Russia pushed for the so-called Normandy format, where only France and Germany, but not any longer the US or other European countries were involved. And now Russia is trying to keep the Europeans out because Trump is now basically a pro-Russian president, and therefore he is much more convenient for Russia. But at the end of the day, the future of Ukraine is very much about the future of Europe, and the security of Ukraine is also about the security of Europe, and Europe will play the crucial role here, and it should get its act together to be able to do that.
Exactly, so it's all about coherence right now. Thank you so much. Andreas Umland was our guest today. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. Please stay tuned to TVP World for more features and more news to come.